Whether you're a student cramming for your Psych 101 final, a curious mind wanting to understand what makes people tick, or just someone who's ever wondered why you and your best friend react so differently to the exact same situation, you've come to the right place. In today's video, we're launching the first episode in a brand new series, 101 Personality Psychology Terms Every Student Must Know. We're going to define each term, provide a clear example, and explain it in a way that's easy to understand and remember. By the end of this video, you'll have a complete foundation in personality psychology, from Freud and the Big Five to self-efficacy, temperament, and everything in between. This is the ultimate study guide for any psychology student. Make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss a single part of this series. All right, let's begin. Section 1. What is personality? This section covers the foundational definitions you need before we dive into the major theories. Understanding these first 8 terms will give you a framework for everything that follows. 1. Personality. First up, the big one. Personality is the unique and relatively stable pattern of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that define an individual over time. For example, if your friend is consistently outgoing, curious, and talkative across different settings, at a party, in a classroom, at home, those enduring patterns are part of their personality. 2. Individual differences. Next, we have individual differences. This term refers to the ways in which people vary from one another in their characteristic patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving. For example, 2 people can experience the same stressful event, say a job interview, and one feels energized by the challenge while the other feels overwhelmed with anxiety. Those differences are the heart of personality research. 3. Personality psychology. Personality psychology is the scientific study of those individual differences, their origins, their structure, their development, and how they influence behavior. For example, a personality psychologist might study why some people thrive under pressure while others crumble, or why certain traits like conscientiousness predict academic success across cultures. 4. Character. Now, this one is important because students often confuse it with personality. Character refers specifically to the moral and ethical dimensions of a person, qualities like honesty, integrity, and compassion. For example, a person might be highly extroverted, which is a personality trait, but whether they use that extroversion to inspire others or to manipulate them, that's a question of character. 5. Temperament. Temperament describes the biologically based, early emerging foundations of personality, the raw emotional and behavioral tendencies you see even in infants. For example, some babies are naturally calm and easygoing, while others are fussy and reactive. These early differences in temperament often persist and form the scaffolding for adult personality. 6. Trait. A trait is a relatively enduring and consistent way of thinking, feeling, or behaving. For example, if someone tends to be organized, punctual, and reliable across many different situations, we might say they are high in the trait of conscientiousness. 7. State. In contrast to a trait, a state is a temporary, situational pattern of thoughts, feelings, or behaviors. For example, even a generally calm person, someone with low trait anxiety, can feel intense anxiety right before giving a speech. That is a state, not a trait. 8. Disposition. A disposition is a general tendency or inclination to respond in a particular way. It overlaps with the idea of a trait, but emphasizes the readiness to act. For example, someone with a cheerful disposition is predisposed to interpret events positively. They are not cheerful every single second, but their default setting leans that way. Now that we've covered the foundational terms, let's move into the theories that shaped personality psychology as a field. Section 2. Psychoanalytic theory. This section covers the core ideas from Sigmund Freud and the psychoanalytic tradition. Love him or question him, Freud's ideas form the historical backbone of personality psychology. and many concepts from this school of thought are still in everyday use. 9. Sigmund Freud. First up, a name you've probably heard. Sigmund Freud was an Austrian neurologist who founded psychoanalysis in the late 19th and early 20th century. He proposed that our behavior is shaped by unconscious motives, early childhood experiences, and inner conflicts among three mental structures. For example, Freud would argue that a person who bites their nails compulsively is not just dealing with a bad habit, but expressing an unconscious conflict rooted in an early developmental stage. 10. Psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis is both a theory of personality and a method of therapy developed by Freud. It proposes that unconscious forces, especially those from childhood, shape our thoughts and actions in ways we are not aware of. For example, a patient in psychoanalysis might describe their dreams on the couch, while the analyst interprets the hidden, symbolic meanings behind those dream images. 11. The unconscious mind. The unconscious mind is the vast reservoir of thoughts, memories, desires, and fears that lie outside of our conscious awareness, yet influence us constantly. For example, you might feel inexplicably uneasy around a particular person and later realize they remind you, unconsciously, of a difficult figure from your childhood. The conscious mind. The conscious mind contains everything we are currently aware of, what we are thinking, perceiving, and feeling in this exact moment. For example, right now you are consciously processing these words, aware of the screen in front of you, and perhaps aware that you're sitting somewhere specific. 13. The preconscious mind. The preconscious mind holds information that is not currently in awareness, but can be easily retrieved. For example, you were not thinking about what you ate for breakfast a moment ago, but as soon as I mention it, you can bring that memory into consciousness. It lives in the preconscious. 14. The id. Freud divided the mind into three structures, and the first is the id. The id is the primitive, instinctual part of personality that operates on the pleasure principle. It wants immediate gratification. For example, a hungry infant cries without any consideration of whether it is convenient for the parent. That is pure id. 15. The ego. The ego is the rational, reality-oriented part of personality that operates on the reality principle. It mediates between the demands of the id, the rules of the superego, and the constraints of the real world. For example, if you are hungry and see someone else's food on the table, your id might want to grab it immediately, but your ego steps in and says, "Let's wait, let's ask," or "Let's go find our own food." 16. The superego. The superego is the moral compass, the internalized ideals, values, and rules we absorb from parents, culture, and society. For example, even when nobody is watching, you might feel guilty about telling a lie. That guilt comes from your superego. 17. Pleasure principle. The pleasure principle is the driving force of the id, the demand that needs be satisfied immediately without regard for consequences. For example, when you feel an impulse to check your phone during a conversation just because you heard a notification, that's the pleasure principle at work. Reality principle. The reality principle guides the ego. It is the ability to delay gratification and navigate the real world to satisfy needs in a socially acceptable way. For example, a student who postpones going out with friends to study for an exam is deferring immediate pleasure for a longer-term goal. That is the reality principle in action. Defense mechanism. A defense mechanism is an unconscious psychological strategy the ego uses to protect itself from anxiety, guilt, or unacceptable thoughts. For example, if someone who is deeply angry at their boss goes home and snaps at their partner instead, they may be using displacement, a defense mechanism that redirects an emotion from a threatening target to a safer one. 20. Repression. Repression is one of the most important defense mechanisms. It involves pushing threatening or painful thoughts, memories, or desires out of conscious awareness. For example, someone who experienced a traumatic event in childhood may have no conscious memory of it as an adult, not because they forgot, but because the mind repressed it. 21. Denial. Denial is refusing to accept reality or facts that are too uncomfortable to acknowledge. For example, a person who has just received a serious medical diagnosis might spend days insisting the test results must be wrong. That is denial, a temporary shield the mind uses until it is ready to cope. 22. Projection. Projection occurs when someone attributes their own unacceptable thoughts or feelings to another person. For example, someone who feels intense jealousy in their relationship might constantly accuse their partner of being unfaithful, not because of evidence, but because they are projecting their own insecurity outward. 23. Rationalization. Rationalization is creating logical-sounding explanations for behaviors that actually have emotional or unconscious motives. For example, after not getting a job, a candidate says, "I didn't really want it anyway. The commute would have been terrible." The real reason is disappointment, but the rationalization protects the ego. 24. Reaction formation. Reaction formation occurs when a person converts an unacceptable impulse into its opposite, often in an exaggerated way. For example, someone with unconscious aggressive impulses might become excessively gentle, nurturing, and conflict avoidant, overcompensating for what lies beneath. Now that we've covered the core of psychoanalytic theory, let's move into the theorists who came after Freud, the Neo-Freudians, who both built on and broke away from his ideas. Neo-Freudian and psychodynamic theories. These theorists took Freud's foundation and expanded it in new directions, emphasizing social factors, lifespan development, and the striving for meaning. 25. Carl Jung. Carl Jung was a Swiss psychiatrist who began as Freud's close collaborator, but developed his own distinct theory called analytical psychology. His key contributions include the collective unconscious, archetypes, and the concepts of introversion and extroversion. For example, Jung would say that the reason similar myths and symbols appear across cultures, the hero, the wise old man, the great mother, is that we all share a collective unconscious containing these universal archetypes. 26. Collective unconscious. The collective unconscious is Jung's term for the deepest layer of the unconscious, a shared, inherited reservoir of memories, symbols, and experiences common to all humans. For example, across ancient Egypt, medieval Europe, and modern Asia, the image of the serpent appears in dreams, myths, and art, not because of cultural transmission, but because it lives in the collective unconscious. 27. Archetypes. Archetypes are universal, archaic patterns and images that arise from the collective unconscious. For example, the persona archetype represents the social mask we wear in public, the face we present to the world that may differ significantly from who we truly are inside. 28. Persona. The persona is the archetype of the social mask, the version of ourselves we construct to navigate society. For example, a teacher might adopt a patient, authoritative persona in the classroom, then return home and shed that mask, revealing a more relaxed, informal version of themselves. 29. Shadow. The shadow is the archetype representing the dark, hidden, or repressed parts of our personality, the qualities we deny in ourselves but often see in others. For example, someone who prides themselves on being gentle may have a shadow containing unacknowledged anger, and they might feel especially irritated by people who openly express aggression. 30. Alfred Adler. Alfred Adler was an Austrian psychiatrist who broke with Freud to develop individual psychology. He emphasized the drive for superiority, the importance of social interest, and the role of birth order in shaping personality. For example, Adler would argue that a youngest child might develop a distinct set of personality traits, like being charming, attention-seeking, or rebellious, as a result of their position in the family constellation. 31. Inferiority complex. An inferiority complex, in Adler's framework, is an intense, often unconscious feeling of inadequacy that can drive a person to overcompensate. For example, a person who felt physically weak as a child might devote their adult life to bodybuilding or martial arts, not just for fitness, but to overcome that deep-seated feeling of inferiority. 32. Striving for superiority. This is Adler's central motivational force, the innate drive to overcome limitations, improve oneself, and achieve mastery. For example, a student who grew up in poverty and becomes a successful entrepreneur is not merely chasing money. They are striving for superiority, working to overcome the feelings of powerlessness they experienced as a child. 33. Birth order. Adler was the first major theorist to argue that birth order systematically shapes personality. For example, according to Adler, firstborn children often develop responsible, achievement-oriented personalities because they initially receive undivided parental attention and later experience being dethroned by siblings. 34. Karen Horney. Karen Horney was a German-born psychoanalyst who challenged Freud's views on female psychology and emphasized the role of social and cultural factors, particularly in the development of neurotic needs. For example, Horney argued that what Freud called penis envy was not a biological reality, but a cultural reflection of the power and status men held in society. Women envied that power, not the anatomy. 35. Basic anxiety. Horney's concept of basic anxiety describes the feeling of being isolated and helpless in a potentially hostile world, a feeling rooted in early childhood experiences. For example, a child whose parents are emotionally distant, inconsistent, or overly critical may develop basic anxiety that shapes their entire adult personality. 36. Neurotic needs. Neurotic needs, in Horney's theory, are exaggerated, rigid coping strategies people develop to manage basic anxiety. For example, someone with a neurotic need for approval might rearrange their entire personality to please others, agreeing with everyone and avoiding conflict at all costs, not out of genuine warmth, but out of deep anxiety about rejection. Now that we've covered the psychoanalytic and psychodynamic traditions, let's move into a very different approach, one that focuses on measuring and describing personality traits rather than exploring unconscious conflicts. Trait theories. This section covers the major trait theorists who sought to identify, measure, and organize the fundamental dimensions of personality. Trait theory asks a different question, not why personality develops, but what personality is made of. 37. Gordon Allport. Gordon Allport is often credited as one of the founding figures of trait theory. He argued that traits are real biological structures in the nervous system and distinguished between cardinal, central, and secondary traits. For example, Allport would say that for most people, friendliness is a central trait. It consistently shapes their behavior. But for someone like Mother Teresa, compassion was a cardinal trait. It dominated and defined her entire life. 38. Cardinal trait. A cardinal trait is a single dominant characteristic that organizes and defines a person's entire life and identity. For example, a person whose entire existence revolves around the pursuit of power, someone like a historical conqueror, might be described as having a cardinal trait of ambition or dominance. 39. Central traits. Central traits are the handful of core characteristics, Allport suggested 5 to 10, that form the foundation of a person's personality. For example, describing a friend as honest, warm, anxious, organized, and curious is identifying their central traits. 40. Secondary traits. Secondary traits are the less consistent, more situational characteristics that emerge in specific contexts. For example, a normally confident person might become nervous when speaking in front of a large crowd. That nervousness is a secondary trait. It appears in a specific situation and does not define the person. 41. Raymond Cattell. Raymond Cattell was a British-American psychologist who used a statistical technique called factor analysis to reduce thousands of personality descriptors into 16 fundamental dimensions, which he called source traits. For example, Cattell's 16 personality factors model, often called the 16PF, measures traits like warmth, reasoning, emotional stability, and dominance on a continuum. 42. Factor analysis. Factor analysis is a statistical method that identifies clusters of related variables. In personality research, it groups together traits that tend to co-occur. For example, if people who are talkative also tend to be assertive and energetic, factor analysis might reveal that these behaviors all load onto a single underlying factor, what we now call extroversion. 43. Source trait. In Cattell's theory, a source trait is a fundamental, underlying dimension of personality, the root cause of the surface behaviors we can observe. For example, a person who is punctual, organized, and careful with money may be expressing a single source trait, conscientiousness. 44. Surface trait. Surface traits are clusters of observable behaviors that appear to go together but may not reflect a single underlying cause. For example, someone might seem both sociable and impulsive on the surface, but Cattell's analysis would trace those to separate source traits: sociability to warmth, impulsivity to low self-control. 45. Hans Eysenck. Hans Eysenck was a German-British psychologist who proposed that personality can be reduced to three major dimensions: extroversion, neuroticism, and psychoticism, often called the Penn model. For example, Eysenck would describe a highly extroverted and highly neurotic person as being prone to strong emotional reactions, particularly in social situations. They might be the life of the party one evening and deeply anxious about what they said the next morning. 46. Extroversion. Extroversion, in Eysenck's model, is a dimension anchored at one end by sociability, energy, and sensation-seeking, and at the other end by quietness, solitude, and lower stimulation needs. For example, the extrovert seeks out lively environments and social stimulation, while the introvert, Eysenck's term for the opposite pole, needs quiet and solitude to recharge. 47. Neuroticism. Neuroticism is the tendency to experience negative emotions like anxiety, worry, guilt, and moodiness, and to be emotionally reactive rather than stable. For example, two people receive the same mildly critical feedback from a supervisor. The person low in neuroticism takes it in stride and moves on. The person high in neuroticism ruminates on it for days. 48. Psychoticism. Psychoticism, the third dimension in Eysenck's Penn model, reflects a tendency toward being tough-minded, independent, antisocial, or aggressive at the high end versus empathetic and cooperative at the low end. For example, someone high in psychoticism might be described as cold, creative in unconventional ways, and largely indifferent to others' opinions. The Big Five model. This is the most widely accepted and researched framework in modern personality psychology. The Big Five, often remembered by the acronym OCEAN, represents 5 broad dimensions that capture the major ways people differ from one another. 49. The Big Five. The Big Five, also called the Five-Factor Model, is a taxonomy of personality that organizes traits into 5 broad dimensions: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. For example, a personality psychologist assessing a client would likely measure where they fall on each of these 5 dimensions, creating a comprehensive personality profile. 50. Openness to experience. Openness describes the degree to which a person is curious, imaginative, creative, and willing to engage with novel ideas and experiences. For example, someone high in openness might love traveling to unfamiliar countries, experimenting with abstract art, and questioning traditional beliefs. Someone low in openness might prefer routine, familiarity, and practical, concrete thinking. 51. Conscientiousness. Conscientiousness reflects organization, self-discipline, dependability, and achievement orientation. For example, a highly conscientious student keeps a detailed calendar, submits assignments early, and double-checks their work before turning it in. Conscientiousness is the Big Five trait most consistently linked to academic and career success. 52. Agreeableness. Agreeableness captures the tendency to be cooperative, compassionate, trusting, and conflict-averse versus competitive, skeptical, and assertive. For example, someone high in agreeableness will go out of their way to help a colleague and avoid arguments, while someone low in agreeableness might challenge ideas directly and prioritize truth over harmony. 53. Neuroticism, in the Big Five. We saw this term in Eysenk's model, and it carries a similar meaning here. In the Big Five, neuroticism is the tendency toward emotional instability, anxiety, sadness, irritability, and mood swings. For example, a person high in neuroticism might interpret a friend's short text message as a sign that the friend is upset with them, spiraling into worry over what might be a completely neutral message. 54. Facets. Each Big Five dimension can be broken down into narrower subtraits called facets. For example, the dimension of extroversion includes facets like warmth, gregariousness, assertiveness, activity level, excitement-seeking, and positive emotions. When someone scores high on extroversion overall, they might still vary across those specific facets. 55. HEXACO model. The HEXACO model is a six-factor alternative to the Big Five. It keeps many of the same dimensions, but adds a sixth, honesty, humility, and reconceptualizes some of the others. For example, someone high in honesty, humility is sincere, fair-minded, and modest. They are not motivated to manipulate others or accumulate status and wealth at others' expense. 56. Honesty, humility. In the HEXACO model, honesty, humility captures sincerity, fairness, greed avoidance, and modesty. For example, a person high in honesty, humility would return a lost wallet with all the cash inside, not because anyone was watching, but because keeping it would feel fundamentally wrong to them. Now that we've covered the dominant trait models, let's move into a very different philosophical approach, one that argues we are more than just a collection of traits. Section 6. Humanistic Theories. This section covers the humanistic movement in psychology, an approach that emphasizes personal growth, free will, and the inherent drive towards self-fulfillment. Humanistic psychologists argued that earlier theories painted too dark and deterministic a picture of human nature. 57. Abraham Maslow. Abraham Maslow was one of the founders of humanistic psychology. He is best known for his hierarchy of needs, a pyramid-shaped model describing the sequence of human motivations, from basic survival to self-actualization. For example, Maslow would say that a person who is starving is not particularly concerned with creativity or morality. They are focused entirely on satisfying their physiological needs. Only once those lower needs are met can they move upward. 58. Hierarchy of needs. Maslow's hierarchy of needs is typically depicted as a 5-level pyramid. Physiological needs at the base, then safety, then love and belonging, then esteem, and finally, self-actualization at the top. For example, a person who has food, shelter, loving relationships, and a sense of accomplishment is well positioned to pursue self-actualization, the fulfillment of their unique potential. 59. Self-actualization. Self-actualization is the highest level in Maslow's hierarchy, the full realization and expression of one's talents, capacities, and potential. For example, an artist who paints not for fame or money, but because creating is the truest expression of who they are. That is self-actualization. Maslow believed only a small percentage of people fully reach this level. 60. Peak experience. A peak experience is a moment of profound joy, transcendence, or connection, a fleeting state in which a person feels fully alive, fully present, and deeply fulfilled. For example, a musician completely lost in a performance, a runner experiencing a deep flow state, or a parent holding their child for the first time. These can all be peak experiences. 61. Carl Rogers. Carl Rogers was another founding figure of humanistic psychology. He developed person-centered therapy and proposed that for a person to grow and thrive, they need an environment of unconditional positive regard, empathy, and genuineness. For example, a therapist using Rogers' approach would not diagnose or direct. They would create a safe, accepting space where the client could explore their own feelings and find their own answers. 62. Self-concept. Self-concept is the collection of beliefs, ideas, and perceptions a person holds about themselves. Their answer to the question, "Who am I?" For example, a person's self-concept might include, "I am a good student," "I am shy around new people," and "I am someone who cares deeply about fairness." These beliefs shape how they interpret new experiences. 63. Ideal self. The ideal self is the person we wish we could be, our internal vision of the best version of ourselves. For example, your ideal self might be more confident, more patient, or more accomplished in a particular domain. According to Rogers, a large gap between the self-concept and the ideal self leads to distress and dissatisfaction. 64. Real self. The real self, sometimes called the actual self, is who we genuinely are, our authentic feelings, desires, and capabilities, as distinct from the persona we project. For example, someone's real self might be deeply anxious and uncertain, even as they present a calm, capable image to the world. 65. Conditions of worth. Conditions of worth are the expectations and standards we internalize from others, the implicit message that we are only lovable or acceptable if we meet certain conditions. For example, a child who receives warmth and approval only when they get good grades may grow into an adult who ties their entire self-worth to professional achievement. 66. Unconditional positive regard. Unconditional positive regard is the acceptance, love, and support offered without conditions or judgment. For example, a parent who tells their child, "I love you no matter what, even when you make mistakes, even when you fail," is providing unconditional positive regard. Rogers believed this was essential for healthy psychological growth. Social cognitive theories. This section shifts focus yet again, from traits and inner drives to the interaction between personal factors, behavior, and the social environment. These theories emphasize learning, observation, and the power of our beliefs. 67. Albert Bandura. Albert Bandura is the central figure in social cognitive theory. He argued that personality is shaped through observational learning, and he introduced the concept of reciprocal determinism, the idea that personal factors, behavior, and the environment all influence each other. For example, a person who believes they are bad at math, which is a personal factor, might avoid math classes. Their environment then provides fewer math learning opportunities, which reinforces their belief. The cycle feeds itself. 68. Reciprocal determinism. Reciprocal determinism is Bandura's model describing the three-way interaction between personal factors like beliefs and cognitive skills, behavior, and the environment. For example, an outgoing child, behavior, seeks social situations. Those environments then reinforce their social skills, which strengthens their outgoing self-concept, which leads them to seek even more social situations. Each factor influences the others in a continuous loop. 69. Self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is one of the most important concepts in social cognitive theory. It is a person's belief in their ability to succeed at a specific task or in a specific domain. For example, a student with high math self-efficacy believes, I can figure this out, when facing a difficult problem. A student with high self-efficacy persists longer and is more resilient after a setback. 70. Observational learning. Observational learning, sometimes called modeling, is learning that occurs by watching others, without direct reinforcement or punishment. For example, a child who watches their older sibling get praised for saying please and thank you learns to use those polite phrases themselves, not because they were directly taught, but because they observed the consequences. 71. Locus of control. Locus of control, introduced by Julian Rotter, describes the degree to which people believe they control the outcomes in their lives. For example, someone with an internal locus of control believes that their effort and decisions determine their success. Someone with an external locus of control believes that luck, fate, or powerful others are in charge. If they fail a test, the internal person says, I didn't study enough, while the external person says, the questions were unfair. 72. Internal locus of control. An internal locus of control is the belief that one's own actions largely determine life outcomes. For example, an entrepreneur with a strong internal locus of control attributes their business success to their decisions and hard work, and when things go wrong, they look at what they can change rather than blaming the economy. 73. External locus of control. An external locus of control is the belief that external forces, luck, fate, powerful others, circumstances, primarily determine outcomes. For example, a student with an external locus of control who fails an exam might say, the teacher doesn't like me, or the test was designed to trick us, rather than examining their own study habits. 74. Learned helplessness. Learned helplessness is a state in which a person or animal stops trying to escape or improve a negative situation, because past experiences have taught them that nothing they do matters. For example, Martin Seligman and Stephen Mayer's classic experiments showed that dogs who had been exposed to unavoidable shocks later failed to escape even when escape was possible. In humans, learned helplessness can underlie depression and academic disengagement. 75. Expectancies. In Rotter's social learning theory, expectancies are the subjective probabilities we assign to outcomes, our internal estimates of how likely a particular behavior is to lead to a particular result. For example, a student's expectancy that studying will lead to a good grade influences whether they study. If past experience has taught them that studying does not help, their expectancy will be low, and so will their effort. 76. Walter Mischel. Walter Mischel is famous for his marshmallow test and for challenging the assumption that personality traits consistently predict behavior across situations. He argued that behavior depends far more on the specific situation than trait theorists had assumed. For example, a child who is impulsive in one setting might be remarkably patient in another, depending on the context and what is at stake. 77. Marshmallow test. The marshmallow test was a series of studies on delayed gratification. Young children were given a choice: eat one marshmallow now or wait and get two later. For example, some children immediately grab the marshmallow, while others use strategies like covering their eyes or singing to themselves to resist temptation. Follow-up studies found that the children who waited longer tended to have better life outcomes, though later research showed the situation was more complex than originally reported. 78. Delay of gratification. Delay of gratification is the ability to resist an immediate reward in favor of a larger or more meaningful reward later. For example, a student who skips a party to study for the MCAT is delaying gratification, trading short-term fun for a long-term career goal. 79. Cognitive-Affective Processing System. CAPS, the Cognitive-Affective Processing System, is Mischel's model of how personality works. It proposes that people have a stable network of mental and emotional units, goals, beliefs, emotions, competencies, that interact with each situation to produce behavior. For example, your CAPS might activate anxiety and avoidance in a situation where you feel judged, but activate confidence and warmth in a situation where you feel competent. Now that we've covered the social cognitive perspective, let's move into what biology and genetics contribute to personality. Biological and genetic approaches. This section covers the evidence that personality is not purely shaped by environment and learning. It is also rooted in our biology, our genes, and the structure and function of our brains. 80. Heritability. Heritability is a statistical estimate of the proportion of variation in a trait within a population that can be attributed to genetic differences. For example, twin studies suggest that the heritability of the Big Five traits ranges from about 40 to 60%, meaning that a substantial portion of personality variation is genetic. But heritability does not mean destiny. It describes populations, not individuals, and it says nothing about how much a trait can be changed. 81. Twin study. A twin study compares identical twins who share 100% of their genes with fraternal twins who share about 50% to estimate genetic and environmental contributions to traits. For example, if identical twins raised apart are more similar on a trait like neuroticism than fraternal twins raised together, that suggests a genetic influence, because the identical twins share more genes despite growing up in different homes. 82. Temperament, revisited. We defined temperament earlier as the biologically based emotional and behavioral tendencies visible from infancy. Now, in the context of biological approaches, temperament research shows that these early tendencies, like activity level, emotional reactivity, and sociability, are substantially heritable and often persist into adult personality. For example, a baby who is highly reactive to loud noises may grow into an adult who scores higher on neuroticism. 83. Behavioral genetics. Behavioral genetics is the field that studies the interplay between genes and environment in shaping behavior and personality. For example, a behavioral geneticist might investigate whether the shared family environment or non-shared individual experiences, like different peer groups, matter more for personality development. The evidence suggests that non-shared environment typically plays a larger role. 84. Jeffrey Alan Gray's reinforcement sensitivity theory. Gray proposed that personality differences arise from the sensitivity of two brain systems, the behavioral activation system, or BAS, which responds to rewards and drives approach behavior, and the behavioral inhibition system, or BIS, which responds to punishment and drives avoidance. For example, a person with a highly sensitive BAS is impulsive and reward-driven. They chase opportunities and excitement. A person with a highly sensitive BIS is anxious and cautious. They scan for threats and avoid risk. 85. Behavioral activation system. The BAS, in Gray's theory, is the neurological system that responds to signals of reward and non-punishment, motivating approach behavior. For example, when you see an opportunity for a promotion at work and immediately start planning how to get it, your BAS is driving that approach motivation. 86. Behavioral inhibition system. The BIS responds to signals of punishment, novelty, and uncertainty, motivating avoidance and caution. For example, if you walk into a room full of strangers and feel an immediate impulse to find a corner and observe rather than engage, your BIS is likely more sensitive than your B. 87. Dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter strongly linked to reward processing, motivation, and, in the context of personality, traits like extroversion and novelty seeking. For example, people high in extroversion may have more responsive dopamine systems, which means they experience social interaction and novelty as intrinsically rewarding. Now that we've covered the biological underpinnings, let's move into how personality is actually measured. Personality assessment. This section covers the major tools and methods psychologists use to measure personality, from structured questionnaires to open-ended interpretive techniques. 88. Self-report inventory. A self-report inventory is a questionnaire in which individuals rate themselves on a series of statements or adjectives. For example, a participant taking the NEO personality inventory might respond to items like, "I am someone who enjoys being the center of attention," on a scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree. Self-report inventories are the most widely used assessment method in personality psychology. The Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory is one of the most extensively researched and clinically used personality assessments. It was originally developed to identify psychological disorders and contains validity scales designed to detect when a respondent is being dishonest, defensive, or exaggerating symptoms. For example, if someone answers true to items like, "I have never told a lie," the validity scales would flag that response pattern as likely dishonest. 90. NEOPIR. The NEO Personality Inventory, revised, is a widely used self-report measure of the Big Five personality traits, with detailed subscales for each of the 30 facets. For example, a psychologist using the NEOPIR would not just learn that a client is high in neuroticism, they would learn whether that neuroticism is expressed mainly as anxiety, anger, depression, self-consciousness, impulsivity, or vulnerability. 91. Projective test. A projective test presents ambiguous stimuli, like ink blots or vague pictures, and asks the person to describe what they see. The idea is that people project their unconscious thoughts, feelings, and conflicts onto the ambiguous image. For example, if a person consistently sees violent or threatening imagery in Rorschach ink blots, a clinician might interpret that as revealing underlying aggressive or fearful impulses. 92. Rorschach ink blot test. The Rorschach is the most famous projective test. It consists of 10 symmetrical ink blots, some black and white, some with color. A respondent looking at one blot might see a butterfly, while another sees two people fighting. The clinician analyzes both the content and the style of the responses to form hypotheses about the person's personality. 93. Thematic apperception test. The TAT is another projective test. It presents a series of ambiguous pictures, usually of people in unclear situations, and asks the respondent to tell a story about each one. What is happening, what the characters are thinking and feeling, and what will happen next. For example, a person who consistently tells stories in which characters are betrayed or abandoned might be revealing themes of mistrust or fear of rejection in their own personality. 94. Reliability. Reliability refers to the consistency of a test, whether it produces stable, repeatable results. For example, if you take a personality test on Monday and take the same test again on Friday, and your scores are nearly identical, the test has high test-retest reliability. Without reliability, the test cannot be valid. 95. Validity. Validity refers to whether a test actually measures what it claims to measure. For example, a personality test that claims to measure extroversion should correlate with real-world behaviors, like how often someone initiates conversations, attends social events, or seeks out stimulating environments. A test can be reliable without being valid, but it cannot be valid without being reliable. 96. Social desirability bias. Social desirability bias is the tendency for respondents to answer personality items in ways that make them look good rather than in ways that reflect their true thoughts and behaviors. For example, someone completing a self-report inventory might underreport how often they feel jealous or angry, even to themselves, because those feelings conflict with their ideal self-image. 97. Observer report. An observer report is a personality assessment completed not by the person themselves, but by someone who knows them well, a friend, family member, or colleague. For example, researchers often find that observer reports and self-reports converge on the Big Five, but they also diverge in informative ways. A person might rate themselves as highly agreeable, while their spouse rates them as only moderately so, and that gap itself is psychologically interesting. Now that we've covered assessment, let's finish with a section that brings everything together: key concepts and applications that bridge theory and daily life. Key concepts and applications. This final section ties the core ideas of personality psychology to concepts you will encounter in other psychology courses and in everyday life. 98. Self-esteem. Self-esteem is a person's overall subjective evaluation of their own worth. For example, someone with high self-esteem generally views themselves as competent, likable, and deserving of good things. Self-esteem is distinct from self-efficacy. The former is about how you feel about yourself overall, while the latter is about how capable you believe you are in a specific domain. 99. Narcissism. Narcissism is a personality pattern characterized by grandiosity, a need for admiration, and a lack of empathy for others. For example, a highly narcissistic person might dominate conversations, react with anger to criticism, and struggle to genuinely care about others' feelings, while simultaneously being deeply dependent on external validation to maintain their inflated self-image. 100. Type A personality. The Type A personality pattern is characterized by competitiveness, urgency, impatience, and a chronic sense of time pressure, often with an undercurrent of hostility. For example, a classic Type A person finishes other people's sentences, gets frustrated in slow-moving lines, and treats even leisure activities like a competition to be won. Research links Type A hostility in particular to increased cardiovascular risk. 101. Resilience. Resilience is the capacity to adapt well, recover, and even grow in the face of adversity, trauma, or significant stress. It is not a fixed trait. It is a dynamic process influenced by personality, social support, and cognitive habits. For example, two people might experience the same devastating loss. One withdraws and remains depressed for years. The other experiences intense grief but gradually rebuilds a meaningful life. Resilience is what allows the second path, and fittingly, it is one of the traits most closely linked to emotional stability, optimism, and, returning to Bandura, self-efficacy. Thanks for joining me on this guide to 101 personality psychology terms. If this video helped you, go ahead and like it, share it with a friend who's studying, and subscribe so you don't miss the next episode in this series. And before you go, if you want to go even deeper, our full Introduction to Psychology course is now streaming. Follow Frank the Sasquatch and his adventures as he navigates the science of the mind, from perception and memory to behavior and beyond. Click the playlist on your screen right now, and Frank and I will see you over there.